Welcome to another episode of Pick Up and Play, folks. My name is DJ Switch. I'm the DJ and MC for the Portland Retro Gaming Expo. And today, my guest is a friend of mine who wrote a book all about Star Trek games. Mat Bradley-Tschirgi has been part of another community of gamers that I was fortunate enough to start hanging out with several years ago. And through keeping track of each other through mutual connections and mutual friendships, I was really glad to find out that his new book is going to be released a little bit later this year. And today I get to sit down and talk with him all about it. So if you're a fan of Star Trek or you're a fan of retro video games, this is going to be the episode for you. As a reminder, you can support this show by going to patreon.com/DJSwitchPDX, where I have extra content for every single episode of this show available up on the Patreon. I call them my lost levels, and some of the spiciest content I've recorded with several of the guests that I've had on this show, it all ends up on Patreon. A lot of stuff that's, frankly, stuff I can't publish on YouTube because of advertising restrictions, because this show is monetized through YouTube. But like when I say monetized, I kind of mean that in quotes. I really don't make anything off of YouTube. We're talking pennies on the dollar for the ad stuff that they run on YouTube. So really the best way to support this show is by going to patreon.com/DJSwitchPDX so that I can continue to have cool guests and continue to generate more content through the podcast as it stands. I also wanted to let you all know that I have some incredibly special guests coming in the next month. I'm really, really looking forward to sharing what I have planned for you in the very near future. But for today, I'm really looking forward to chatting with my friend Matt about Star Trek and retro games. Mat Bradley-Tschirgi, thank you so much for hanging out with me today on the podcast. I really appreciate your time, man.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, it's been a long time coming. We were chatting a little before the show today. Matt and I have known each other for quite some time. And the last time we talked about doing a podcast together was in 2014. And
yeah, I couldn't believe that.
So I was looking at our chat history. I was like, 2014, no way. And then here's the thing. I looked at the date for that chat in 2014 and I know what happened. And I saved it so that I could get it on record on the recording. I wanted to tell you what the hell happened.
Okay.
You and I were talking about having you on as a guest for my old podcast, Dangerous Kids.
Right.
A week before it ended. I looked at the timestamp. It was like end of May, and I'm like, no way. Yeah, that's what happened, man. Like, I literally was working on trying to get you on the show and work you into the schedule, and then the show broke up. Now, thankfully, all of my friends, like, we're all still friends. Like, we didn't have any, like, big falling out. But it was very clear the last couple of recording sessions, like, it was time to end the show, and we had to sort of have a sort of unceremonious, like, last episode. And that's it. And then you and I just, we've sort of seen each other in passing, and we have several mutual friends. But unfortunately, it took us this long to finally sit down and record with each other. So I'm stoked to finally be here with you, man.
No, likewise. It's nice that you reached out. I appreciate it. And yeah, it's hard to believe that was a decade ago, more or less.
Yeah, but basically, yeah. But we're here. We made it. And we're here to talk about your brand new book that's going to be coming out a little bit later this summer, right? The official date is August, I think.
Yeah, it comes out in the U.S. August 30th, 2024, and the name of the book is Star Trek Video Games: An Unofficial Guide to the Final Frontier. Mm-hmm. And I wrote it for White Owl Books, which is an imprint of Pen and Sword Books. They're a UK publisher. And I have to say, when I submitted the book to them and I got the final proof, they added all the UK spellings. So to see all the extra U's and vowels and things, it really threw me for a loop. Because when you get that final proof PDF in publishing, you're really limited as to what you can correct at that point without it costing extra money. So I was like, oh, that's right. It's a UK publisher. I forgot, because I don't, in between the emails and stuff, there's not that many words that come up that,
Yeah.
Have a flavor with the U or whatever the word is, right?
I mean, thankfully it's still like readable at least, right?
Yes,
there's not
absolutely. Yeah.
I don't think there's going to be too much of a language barrier there, just kind of aside from a light chuckle from the Americans. Yep. But the book itself is structured really interestingly. And I love the way that you decided to break it up in terms of like the eras of Star Trek itself. So we've got the original series, Next Generation. You have DS9 and Voyager in the same sort of like chapter.
I do, because there wasn't that many DS9 and Voyager games, or at least not that many that I covered. And I mean, originally when I pitched the book to them, the table of contents, well, I let them know right up front, it wasn't going to be every Star Trek game, because it's not, but I look at 42 of them. Mm-hmm. And I happen to like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, so 42 is a nice coincidence. That wasn't the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. I wasn't meaning to have that, but it was a nice, happy accident.
Right.
And you get your kind of page count, and you write out. I just had a list chronologically, and then as I'm reading it, I was speaking on Instagram to Mike, an old neighbor of mine who's really into Star Trek, probably more than I am in some ways, and I was like, well, it struck me as it'd be a pretty garbled reading experience if you're reading chronologically and it's like, oh, here's some original Star Trek stuff. Wait, this is a Next Generation game. Oh, now it's DS9. Now it's a cell phone game. So that's why that kind of gave me the idea to split it up by series, because it struck me like if you're a fan, you'll want to see which games are from the Star Trek series. That's my favorite. And Star Trek is like Doctor Who or some of these or Star Wars or some of these properties that have been around for a long time. And so everyone has a favorite, and everyone's favorite is different. So I thought, why not lean into that? And you can read the book out of order, but I think if you do read it in order, I was trying to sort of tell a history of computer games through Star Trek video games.
Yeah.
In a way, was my intended goal, at least.
And I think that reads. I think that as you go through the book and you sort of see how the games change as the technology changes, going from the early text-based stuff to moving into the simple graphic stuff of the 8-bit era and then the 16-bit era, seeing how they incorporated more puzzles and more like interactive features as the technology improved to sort of allow that, going into the Genesis, Super Nintendo, going beyond that. And seeing how not only how the technology improved the way that the games are played as the generations sort of roll over, but also I think it was really fascinating how you touched on the way that the creators of the games were trying to appeal to a Star Trek audience, because I don't think anybody would disagree with the assumption that a Star Trek audience is its own kind of unique set of challenges when it comes to finding something that appeals to them. We're not appealing to the same crowd as, say, like an NBA Jam.
Right. And I mean, Star Trek, rightfully or not, is considered sort of one of the more intellectual science fiction TV shows, right?
Exactly.
And it's, how do you make that as a video game? And it's a lot of different, I made sure to pick out games that were a lot of different genres. In that, whatever genre was popular at the time, they tried to do a Star Trek game of, and these things made money, which is why they keep on making them. I also, have the mobile games in there because you want stuff more recent. And in fact, the book was delayed a little bit because it was what inspired the book to begin with was the trailers I saw in the announcements about this game, Star Trek Resurgence, which it's from, let me look up I have the book in front of me. Let me look up the publisher of that. But it's by a team that used to be old people from Telltale Games. And it kind of struck me as something going kind of full circle a bit. Brunner House is the publisher, and then the developer is Dramatic Labs, right? So I think what is with there is it's like a kind of full circle with like the Star Trek 25th anniversary or Star Trek Judgment Rights games, where it's more those graphic adventures where you're going around, you're solving puzzles. To me, it feels more Star Trek than like a flight simulator.
Right.
And it felt like at least, there's going to be Star Trek games. They were made before I was born. I was born in 1982. They'll be made after I die, whenever that is, hopefully no time soon. And Star Trek is something that'll be around. It's been around for generations. It'll continue to do so. And at least there I could tie it in where it's kind of going full circle, trying to make games like they used to be. Not that the older games are better necessarily, but that they're doing a game that's more narrative, that's more about puzzles and people thinking, something that sort of feels more like Star Trek. Because to my mind, Star Trek is a show, I think, ideally where you're, the whole Star Trek crew, whatever crew it is, goes to a planet and they're trying to solve a problem. And there's usually two sides, maybe more, and they each have their own point, and you can kind of interact with it as you're watching it. Oh, I think they should go with the aliens, or they should do what the Federation says, or whatever it is, and then they make a point at the end. And it's kind of, I think, why people like to debate and like to talk about it, and it requires some from the viewers. And I mean, is Star Trek something like, had you played any of these games before and you read the book? I'm kind of curious. Or
I mean, yes, I have been playing Star Trek games off and on my entire life. My dad was a massive Star Trek fan. He's the one that introduced me to The Next Generation. I mean, I was born in 84. So, I mean, you and I aren't that far off from each other. We had probably very similar experiences with Star Trek growing up, like lots of reruns, lots of TNG. And then in the 90s, obviously, we get into DS9 and Voyager. And what a lot of folks may not know about me, especially in the retro gaming community, which is largely the audience for this show, is that I also I co-host the Star Trek panels and meetups for like the local Comic-Cons. So Fan Expo, Rose City Comic-Con. I've got a friend of mine who runs a magazine called Star Trek Quarterly, and she does the circuit of Star Trek conventions and stuff. But she lives here in Portland, and she usually has me on as either a co-host or a guest commentator for the panels and meetups that she hosts. And so I've been kind of steeped in the Star Trek fandom world more than I ever probably thought that I would be over the last few years. And so it's really fascinating kind of taking that perspective and then sort of winding the clock back and going, oh, dang, okay, so this is what they were doing in the 80s when video games were the hot new thing, but the technology was still in its very, very early days, right? And like as a retro gaming show, when I saw that you were putting out this book full of retro games, and it happened to be about Star Trek retro games, I was like, no way. Like, this is way too perfect. There's no way I'm not going to have you on to talk about this book. And then, and this is the part where I get to give you some flowers a little bit. I open up the book and there's interviews with some of the people involved in some of those old games, like some of the people on the writing team, some of the people on the design teams. And like, you put a lot of work into this book, a lot more, frankly, than I was expecting. And that was such a pleasant surprise. Thank
you. Yeah. I mean, the interviews were something, and maybe in retrospect, I could have put more of those in. It just was because there's this chapters I cut out actually, because I wanted to, you have your word count you're trying to hit with the publisher.
Sure. Yeah.
And whatever. But yeah, I think interviews are something I've always enjoyed. I grew up with, I guess, Nintendo Power would have been the first magazine I was into, like Nintendo's propaganda magazine, basically. And
not propaganda. What are you talking about?
And then later on, things like PC Gamer, Computer Gaming World, and you would get some of these books like, what was the one, like Game Over, The Ultimate History of Video Games, or these books that had all these interviews. And the interviews was always what I liked the most about the magazines.
Yeah.
And I've done freelance journalism for a while online, whether in books or as articles. I've done some pieces in Polygon and stuff like that. So yeah, I think it was important to talk to some designers and producers and also have some critics in there as well and kind of get a bit of the fan perspective. So I tried to spread that throughout. I was surprised at some of the people I could get. It's, it can take a bit to get people's attention. I think the one that, I like all the interviews I did, but I think the two that sort of meant the most to me personally is one is right off the bat, there's some games in here that are unofficial Star Trek games, right? They didn't have the license to do it for real. And one is Trek Trivia, which was the first Apogee game from Scott Miller. And Scott Miller was the co-creator of Duke Nukem 3D, which was like something I loved as a kid. So that was a blast with that. And then I think on Star Trek Judgment Rights, I speak to Michael A. Stackpole, who not only wrote a bunch of the Star Wars X-Wing novels, but he also worked on older computer games like Wasteland, and he wrote on these older Star Trek games.
Yeah.
So to talk to people that I grew up admiring is, I always get a kick out of that. And we'll continue to do so. That's something that I think made it rewarding. And I wanted to have it, because if you just have a book, in my opinion, that's just reviews and things, you can find that on any blog on the internet. You have to give people something a bit more for it to be a book.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, I think that what makes these types of nonfiction books fascinating, is that it's when it comes to something like video games, where you have these massive fan bases and people get so connected to not just the stories, but also just the medium itself. Right. That's the wild part to me, is that the video game industry is full of people who just love video games. And in a lot of cases, like, don't even care what video games. Like, obviously they prefer the good ones over the not good ones, and there's plenty of each to go around. But generally speaking, you and I met in a community full of people who just love video games. We met through the Destructoid community back in the day. And
that's right. Yeah. I think where we met, I was thinking about this the other day, is you were with our mutual friends when we all went to see Thor in the theater, the first one.
I think that sounds right. Yeah. Which is funny, because I met like Eric and Tony,
right,
and Evan. I met those guys up at PAX in 2010. I was hanging out with so I was doing a bit of journalism at the time, and I was hanging out with another friend of mine who was writing for Play Magazine. And he goes, "Yo, there's a Destructoid party going on. Do you want to go hang out?" And I was like, "Can we do that?" He's like, "Yeah, that's fine. Come on." And so we go over to this like restaurant that was kind of nearby where PAX was happening in Seattle. And I walked
Lion Pub.
Maybe that might have been. I mean, it was years ago, so I don't quite remember.
I was at PAX 09. I wasn't at 2010, but anyhow, carry on.
But yeah, so I walk in, PAX 2010, like after party thing. I walk in and I meet Hamza, who was the community manager for Destructoid back then. And I go, "Yeah, my name's Switch. I'm a DJ from Portland. I also do a bit of journalism work. This is my buddy Steve, who works for Play Magazine. We're here to hang out." And he goes, "Oh, you're from Portland? There's a whole table full of guys from Portland right over there." and so I walked up and I was like, "Yo, I'm a DJ that plays nerd events and I want to hang out." And I'll never forget this. It was like Evan and Tony and whoever else was there were all like, "Yo, hey, cool. Nice to meet you. Good to meet you. I'm so-and-so, whatever." And then there was Eric, who was like, "Yeah."
Yes. Eric is always the most outgoing, I think. Not that anyone else, but I think I met up with all those Portland Destructoid guys I moved to Portland from Atlanta, Georgia in 2006. So I think it would have been 2007.
Okay.
I think they did a NARP, no apparent reason party at, some guy even flew into Portland and we went to his hotel room and played Rock Band.
Okay. That sounds about right.
We went to that creepy clown arcade off of Belmont. I don't know if that's still there, but,
Wonderland?
Yes.
The Avalon, I believe, is still there. Yeah.
That's crazy. Yeah. Anyhow, but this is getting a bit in the weeds, but yeah, sure. But I think when I knew Tony, I would do parties at my house when I lived by PSU, and I didn't even realize, I think he was underage and we were all having or whatever. So
great, thanks. Yeah, my sponsor's gonna love that.
Okay, maybe cut that out.
But anyway, yeah, man. You and I have known each other for some time, and it's cool that we met through a community of gamers. And fast forward however many years, and we're still sort of circling a community of gamers, people who just love video games. And I think that that's the kind of audience that this book is exactly for. The way that this read reminded me very much of like a Brett Weiss type of book, where it's nonfiction, but also still really well covered and really does the subject matter service.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I wanted to keep it entertaining. I wanted to have it funny. I also cut jokes out of it because I thought it was getting too jokey at some points. And it's a tricky balance because Star Trek is a broad topic, and I figured people will read this that like Star Trek that don't like video games, or maybe they like video games and they don't like Star Trek. So certainly making it, I think, an easy but informative read and making it accessible. I didn't want such a hardcore nerd book that if someone off the street opened it, it looked like they were reading hieroglyphics.
Right. Some of those. I was going to say some of those like 5 to 7 syllable words that
yes.
Jordy used to spit out randomly. Yeah.
Jeez. But to that point, a late minute, we were talking before the show about this, but a late minute addition to the book I did was adding a glossary to the front, because it struck, I didn't intend this to be a history book, but in a way it sort of is about computer game history.
Yeah.
And I was talking about things like CD-ROMs and sound cards and
ASCII.
Things that don't really, ASCII, of course, right?
Yeah,
things
right.
that don't really exist that much anymore. Or if they do, it's, in a pretty hardcore fan base. So
it was funny to me. You included the word diskette, which
yes.
I like, having grown up in a computer store since the 80s. Like in my world, who the hell doesn't know the word diskette? But like when you stop to think about it, it's 2024 and there's a ton of people that didn't grow up in the 80s like we did. So like that's such a clever inclusion, because I would have probably overlooked something like the word diskette. It isn't really in our lexicon anymore. That technology is so ancient at this point.
Right. And you have to think too with, you use something, I don't know, like Microsoft Word, and the icon to save is still a diskette. But do younger people know what that graphic even is, or what it means, or the visual metaphor for it?
Yeah.
Like it's all these things still exist one way or another in their own way. But even to find a computer with the CD-ROM, or it'd be a Blu-ray drive, I suppose now, or a 4K drive,
right,
is pretty hard to find. You can get an external one. But yeah, I mean, a big challenge, to write the book was a challenge, of course, and a fun one at that, but to figure out what games to limit it to, but also getting these games to run on a Windows 11 desktop.
Oh no.
Was very difficult. I don't have a computer lab with 10 different computers or whatever. That'd be the ideal way to do it. But I think your listeners are probably familiar with like GOG.com or Steam. And so you can maybe get a dozen Star Trek games legitimately, but the older stuff is abandonware, and trying to get that stuff to run, especially the Windows 95, 98 era, that stuff was hard to get running at the time.
Right.
So to try and run that on modern hardware is maddening. At a certain point, I was thinking, I don't know if I can even finish this book, because you sell the idea for the book and it's like, yeah, I sold a book. Wait, I have to write it. Oh shit, how do I get this damn game to run? But you figure stuff out one way or another. And even things like taking pictures could be tricky for some of these things to make the pictures interesting. And it was 3 pictures per game. One of them was on the title screen, because I think especially with old games, the title screen is important, because you see the title screen all the time. It's not like save states, like stuff now. Sometimes I wonder whether I wasted one of the 3 pictures for each game on the title screen, but I still sort of stick by it. I think you can, if nothing else, the book's about nostalgia. And you look at the title screen and you're like, oh, I remember that. Maybe you don't recognize the game from the title, but you recognize the graphics on the title screen.
Well, here's the thing, and I actually have some input on this. I think it was the smart choice to include the title screen for 2 reasons. One, like we kind of touched on already, there's going to be a lot of folks that maybe read this book or pick up this book and thumb through it that have never seen some of these games. Right. But also, 2, the nice thing about a title screen is, by its nature, a title screen is designed to give you a feel and flavor and set the mood for a game without ruining anything or spoiling anything. And so I think it's also incredibly important to, when you're going through and pulling screenshots, that you're pulling screenshots that aren't going to be spoilers. I'm sure you wouldn't have too much trouble finding other screens that don't include spoilers, but the title screen is such a safe bet in that case that it's like one less of the 10,000 things that you're thinking about as you're laying these pages out, right?
Exactly. And also, I mean, part I guess your listeners might want to hear behind the scenes stuff, but when working with the publisher, they demand the pictures are a certain resolution. And it's like, wait a second, some of this DOS stuff is less than even 320 by 240. But I used a program to do the upscaling, and I think the stuff looks as good as it can, all things considered, but especially some of that text stuff looks a little weird when blown up. Like, I haven't seen a hard copy of the book yet, even though it's out in England. So I should be getting my free copies coming in soon, but I'm curious to see how it looks on the printed page. Cause,
what, was the review copy that you sent me, was that a final version or was that an earlier draft?
No, that was a final version. It was a PDF.
Okay.
But I don't get it because of the time it takes to print physical copies of these books and then get them mailed to me from England or whatever. These books will show up. The free books I get as part of being an author will show up to my house when they show up. But like, I never got a proof version that was a hard copy before it came out.
Gotcha.
But the PDF is the final version for all intents and purposes. And people, if you go to Amazon and you search Star Trek video games books, you can pre-order it. And it's on the Kindle and in hardcover. And there's a softcover version coming out later. I don't know exactly when that'll be. If that's not near the end of the year, it'll be sometime in 2025.
Gotcha. I'm very much a hardcover guy. Like, given the choice between the two, I always lean towards the hardcover. So I'll have to keep an eye out for when I have the opportunity to get my order in. To that end, pre-orders are available now for the American release or no?
Yes. Yeah.
They are.
They're available now for the American release, and worldwide, whatever Amazon site you want to go to, you can find it on there.
Okay.
And if you're in Portland, you can even get it from Pal's Books.
Oh, there you go. Hey.
So I had to approach them individually, and they have sort of a form you fill out. I didn't even know that they approved it for sale on their site for the physical version, but I only found out because I posted about the book on LinkedIn, and a friend of mine is like, hey, by the way, you're on Pal's website. And it's like, that would have been nice to know from Pal's, but okay.
Oops.
I'm sure they have so many people submitting them books they want them to stock. So that was I got a kick out of that, having lived in Portland for about 19 years.
Yeah, I expect most of the audience for this show is probably pretty familiar with Portland. But just on the off chance that anyone listening isn't, Powell's Books is very much like a local mainstay. Like, it's a locally owned and operated massive book emporium that's right in the middle of downtown. And like, if you're from Portland, you know what Powell's Books is and probably have hung out there, had coffee there, whatever.
Right. They even have a smaller version of Powell's Books at the PDX at the Portland airport. So
yeah. No, Powell's is very synonymous with Portland, and especially with Portland nerds. If you're a bookhead in Portland, then you're very familiar with Powell's, I'm sure. But that's really awesome, man. I'm really stoked that you're it seems like things are going along well, and that your sort of network of pre-orders is coming together, and hopefully that it sells. Like, fingers crossed that you do some decent numbers once this thing actually hits the U.S. shores.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm definitely eager to see how it does. So I mean, I'm looking at the table of contents here. There's a lot of games that are covered. And are there ones you had specific questions about, or do you mean to pick out some that I thought were? I do, but okay. I want to save that for the second half of the show. So we're going to take a quick break. We're going to check in with our sponsor, Vault 31 Bar, and we will be right back. Folks, this episode has once again been sponsored by my friends at Vault 31 Bar. Just 10 minutes north of the Portland airport, Vault 31 is a video game themed bar built for absolutely everyone who loves gaming and geek culture. They offer an incredible selection of beverages and signature cocktails alongside tons of PC and console games available to play. And if you're hungry, they've got plenty of food available from their kitchen, including house-made pizzas, Smurshbergs, and all kinds of deliciously themed options. Anyone who's caught past episodes of this show knows that Vault 31 is all about inclusivity and wants to make sure that absolutely everyone is welcome.
as part of their ongoing efforts to make sure they are a space for all gamers. They recently announced that they've purchased the space next door and will be renovating it into an all-ages coffee bar and lounge space so that even the under 21 folks will find safe harbor here. As if that wasn't enough, Vault 31 hosts all kinds of community events, including mini painting, tournaments, pride events, and is currently the home of my newest monthly lo-fi event, but you'll have to follow myself and Vault 31 on socials to find out more about that. Speaking of socials, you can visit them at vault31bar.com or at Vault31bar on Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube, and Twitch. Or honestly, just visit them in person. I promise there's no cryopods or vacuum cleaners with a human brain attached. If you know, you know. This place is freaking great. And if you're looking for a space that feels like home away from your nerd cave, Vault 31 is that place for me. Just tell them DJ Switch said hi. With that, let's get back to the show. So Matt, I want to talk a little bit about some of the choices behind the book. And I actually want to start, even though this is a retro gaming show, I actually want to start all the way at the end and talk a little bit about your choice to do the Paramount Plus and Beyond stuff, which I thought was really fascinating because, you know, there's so much history and there's so much depth in the early Star Trek stuff. I really appreciate that you're not leaving out the new folks. You're not leaving out Star Trek Prodigy or Lower Decks. Can you talk a little bit about like your decision to go that far forward and what your hope was and sort of connecting those to the earlier stuff?
Sure. And I guess I can give sort of my history with Star Trek real quick, if you like.
Yeah, please.
The first Star Trek I saw, I was like 8 years old. On videotape, we rented Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. And that's a strange one to be your first Star Trek movie because it's a fish out of water story, no pun intended. And if you don't know what the crew is like, well, it's a whale of a tale. No,
I think you need to own those puns, sir.
Yes, that's right. No, sure. But with Star Trek, with that movie, right? If you don't know what the crew was like to begin with, and the first time you're watching them is them in San Francisco in the 80s, like you don't know what the hell you're watching. I mean, it was. And my dad, he was a little kid when the original series came out, and in college would watch the reruns a lot, but we didn't, because I lived overseas until I was, I don't know, like almost done with third grade. We didn't have access to a lot of things. So I didn't really get much into Star Trek until I was in high school, I guess. And then my wife is really into it. And basically since then, long story short, we've been on a few of the Star Trek cruises where it's like a Star Trek convention on a cruise, and you get to go to panels and rub shoulders with the celebrities if they want to talk to you or if they want to get away from you. Some of them do that as well. It's to be getting
I want to do that so bad. Like,
no,
I'm jealous.
It's a blast. It's a blast. We're doing it our third time in 2025, and then we're going to have to take a break because we want to go to real places like Europe and
real places.
Well, not real places, but I mean, we've done, Mexico, we've done Mexico and the Bahamas and all that's cool, but I wanted to go to, countries that are further out and stuff I've been meaning to do.
Not floating on water with a bunch of nerds.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Got it.
Which I mean, but anyhow, long story short, especially from going on these cruises, it really struck me that the Star Trek new shows have just as passionate fans as the old ones. And since we've had Paramount Plus, we've had more Star Trek content than ever. So that's part of why I wanted to include those. And also you want to include the newest games possible. And this is sort of funny. So as I said before, I had delayed it because Resurgence coming out was the big new one. And thematically, I liked how it's kind of bookended the thing. Right. And then after I submitted my final my final draft to the publisher, they had announced a new Star Trek game, Star Trek Infinite, which is like a 4X Masters of Orion kind of thing. And I'm like, damn it. But the point is, you try and make it as up to date as you can. And in the time between me turning in my pretty close to final draft and then publishing it was like about a little bit over a year, which is, average. Some bigger publishing houses can take 2 to 3 years to publish, like 2.5 years to publish something. So you get as up to date as you can with the things, but that's why I did that. And Prodigy is probably the one I've seen the least of. I guess out of the newer Star Trek shows, I like Strange New Worlds the most, and season 3 of Picard was really a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating how they've struck this sort of interesting set of personalities for each show. You've got Discovery, which is a little bit of a mystery show. You've got
Mm-hmm.
Strange New Worlds, which is more classic Monster of the Week type Star Trek. And then you have something like a Picard, which is so obviously like fan service, but also has its own compelling stories, and in a lot of ways, what I really loved about Picard was how it sort of like plays to an aging audience. You know,
Yes, and
what
it's
do you
about
do when you're retired?
right.
What do you do when you get into those golden years? Yeah,
It's about aging too. I mean, the actors are getting older, especially Patrick Stewart as Jean-Luc Picard, and
yeah,
it. And you're right. They kind of, I think, no matter what kind of things you like, you can find a Star Trek for you if you're wanting to search for it. We're trying to get a friend of ours into Star Trek, and I think because she's a big fan of West Wing, she might like DS9. Might be a good one for her.
yeah,
And but Lower Decks I think is very funny. That
yeah.
one is. It took me a bit to get used to. At first, it was a bit too manic, and to find Star Trek leaning so hard into the comedy. I mean, there's funny episodes of Star Trek, but
Right.
But
Very
when
very
the show,
Futurama.
yes, yeah, Futurama is a good comparison.
Yeah.
So,
But
then I'm looking. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was gonna say, but I think you're absolutely right though, that like once that show sort of like found its rhythm, then it was able to tell compelling stories and able to sort of create these more well-rounded and sort of deep characters that you like. I honestly wasn't expecting that level of depth and that level of heart from the stories on Lower Decks. Like, you know, after seeing the first season, I was like, this is fun, I'll watch the next one. And then after season 2, I was like, oh no, I really like these people and I really want this to keep going.
Yes, and then you even have they have a lot of really deep cuts with their references, and then you have characters that on the one hand should be ridiculous, like Peanut Hamper,
Right.
who then pay off later in different ways. And yeah, I think there's a lot more going on than what's on the surface.
So you tapped into some of the more recent games with the more recent properties. One of the games that you did cover was Bridge. Is it Bridge Simulator?
Was it Bridge Commander?
Bridge Command, or no, Bridge Commander. But then there's a VR game that came out, I think in 2017, called Bridge Crew. And I noticed that there's been a couple of other VR games. It seemed like VR was not present on the list of games covered. Now I know you called out the fact that you didn't like get to all of them. But if you were to do a sequel to this book, do you think the VR stuff would be on your table?
I think so. You know, I don't have a VR helmet myself, but you can still. I've played Star Trek Bridge Crew without the helmet on the PlayStation version, and that was a lot of fun, even though the gameplay was a bit simpler.
Sure.
You know, one chapter I almost included, and I didn't just because I hated the game so much. I even did an interview for it, and I still cut the chapter. Was the game just titled Star Trek, where it was based off the J.J. Abrams reboot?
Oh yeah.
And that
I forgot
that was
about
a
that
co-op game. That was a co-op game with good reason. Yeah, no, it was a co-op game where you play as Kirk and Spock, and it has these frustrating puzzles and bad collision. And other than the part where you're on the bridge between missions, like it's just flat out not unplayable, but like it's just clearly rushed and bad, and they got all the voices from the movie and stuff. I think the intention was there, but even J.J. Abrams was quoted at how disappointed he was in the game.
I feel like that game specifically, you could compare it to something like a Sonic the Hedgehog 2006.
It's not quite that bad, but yeah,
like maybe Sonic was worse than the Star Trek game, but like in terms of like forgettability. We'll all just sort of move on and pretend that it didn't happen.
Yeah, you know, at the time, I think I had maybe been married for a year or something, and I thought of maybe buying the game and I could play it through with my wife, Ivana, and I just rented it instead. And I'm so glad I did, because after we play it for 30 minutes or an hour or so, she's like, "We don't have to keep playing this, do we?" And I said, "No."
Oh no.
Because, you know, there was kind of the idea like, like some of the Lego games or some of the other co-op stuff back in the day we'd play, right?
Right.
And so the idea is like, oh, maybe the Star Trek one will be good, but it wasn't. And I say right up front, you know, some of these games are great, some of these are awful, and that's part of the Star Trek experience.
Right.
I get people asking me, you know, what I think about Star Trek games compared to Star Wars games, and I would say the Star Wars games are more consistent in quality, but they're probably less interesting than the Star Trek games, because the Star Trek ones tend to be a bit out there a bit more, and I think take a bit more chances.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. They're sort of taking bigger risks. I wonder though, and this is, I mean, I have more like specific parts of the book I want to touch on, but just sort of overall, as like a general consensus, do you find that the games follow the same even odd theory as the movies?
No. No, but that's a good question. I never thought of it that way. I think some of it is like as we said earlier, the genres are a better fit for the Star Trek license.
Okay.
And that helps. And some of these just are beyond saving, but I think part of what was fun researching this game is like my computer I had a 46 computer, 66 megahertz with a whopping 8 megabytes of RAM at a double speed CD-ROM drive back in the day.
Easy. So, that's a lot of horsepower.
At the time it was, but like I couldn't run a lot of these Star Trek games I wanted to play. So I think in a way the book was kind of wish fulfillment to go back and play these things that I wanted to as a kid. And I sort of thought back to get in the mindset, like the amount of times I'd waste in stores just reading the back of boxes for these games I couldn't afford, or reading these magazine reviews with the pictures before the internet and kind of imagining what the game would be like and then seeing what the reality of it is. You didn't have Twitch streams or YouTube or any of that. It was a different time. Right?
You know, it's funny. Brett Weiss said something real similar to me about part of the process for going through his books was like getting a chance to go back through games he never got to play as a kid. And I think that's a really, really cool way to sort of like appreciate the work, is that you still you sort of like tap in with that inner child a little bit, and you sort of go, what did I miss out on as a kid that I want to make sure that I get to use as an excuse to do it for work? And I think that comes through in the writing. If you pick up and thumb through this Star Trek games book, you quickly start to realize like, oh, he's enjoying himself. And like there's so much interesting and nuanced discussion to be had about each one of these games. In some cases, literal discussion in the interviews, right? But also like even in the parts that weren't interview based and you're just sort of offering your own thoughts, it was clear to me that you were going through these games with the critical eye of an author while also just enjoying the shit out of yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it was quite the journey, to say the least. And I hope people like it. And if it does well, maybe we'll see a second one. Who knows? Because there's no lack of Star Trek games out there.
One of my earliest Star Trek video game experiences was playing Star Trek The Next Generation on the Sega Genesis. And I could swear up and down, I would bet money, I would bet a finger that game was called Star Trek The Next Generation. And in this book, you've got it labeled as Futures Past. How does that happen, and why am I so wrong?
So the game was the same game on SNES and Sega Genesis, but it had a different title on each one.
Yeah.
Neither one was just Star Trek The Next Generation, but I think it's one of those things where, oh, I'm going to play the Star Trek The Next Generation game. I think it's one of those where you might refer to the title a bit more casually, or if it's this game that you play over and over again, you're kind of running through the title screen. You're not sort of maybe taking the whole title into consideration.
Yeah.
Back in the day when you're playing it, and
it's very possible. I was one of those kids that like mashed the start button Start game,
Right.
start game, start game. I don't care. Start game.
And I do think it's weird that like it's a different title on SNES and Genesis, even though it's the same game.
Same
More or
story,
less.
same everything.
Same story.
Yeah.
But that is a good point in that, one, you don't get games based on movies a lot anymore. Or if you do, they're a skin for Fortnite or something like that, or a mobile game.
Right.
But two, oftentimes I don't know, let's say it's the Flintstones or something on Super Nintendo and Game Boy, those would be totally different games. It was pretty unusual that it would be a port of the same game for the different systems.
Right, because they would usually end up going to two different production houses who had two completely different philosophies on how to build out an experience.
Right.
Aladdin is one of the big ones. Whenever I have this specific discussion, I always go back to Aladdin, which was so much prettier on the Super Nintendo, but played so much better and was so much more fun on the Genesis. And so, like, if we ever had an Aladdin that looked like the Super Nintendo version but played like the Sega Genesis version, we would have had the best of both those worlds. But the contrast between the two was so wildly different to anybody that had was lucky enough to play both back in the day. I think it really like drove home the fact that these are being made by completely different teams, and these are games that are being published in other sides of the world from each other. And so like you're never going to get the same game out of two different houses. It just doesn't work like that.
Right. And I think one of the weirder examples of that was, this is a pretty late example for the original 8-bit NES, but you had two Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade games for the NES, and they were totally different.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's something that was extremely bizarre. I don't even know how that I'm sure one publisher had the license and then it switched to another one, but it's like, was there that much of a demand for two Indiana Jones games based on the same movie for the same system? I don't think so, but.
Right. And then you had, there was another conversation that I was having with, John Riggs, prolific YouTuber collector, that I had on the show here. He and I were talking about Roger Rabbit. And how Roger Rabbit on the PC played very differently than Roger Rabbit on the NES. And it was one of those rare occurrences where I actually preferred the NES version because of the play style and the controls over the prettier version that was on the Amiga.
Right. Well, and then, I mean, you want to get into the weeds in Roger Rabbit. You remember on the NES, there was a game called Bugs Bunny's Crazy Castle?
Yes, I remember that game. I played it a little bit, but I remember.
Not a great game, but in Japan that was a Roger Rabbit game. But in the US they didn't have the license.
Wait, what?
Yeah. In Japan, Bugs Bunny's Crazy Castle was a Roger Rabbit game where you're Roger Rabbit and the enemies of the weasels. And look it up. It's really bizarre, but so when they brought it to the States, they made it instead your Bugs Bunny. And then instead of the weasels, the enemies were like Sylvester the cat and whoever else was the enemies. It's been a long time since I played that one. So
that's one of those like, and folks in the retro community, maybe they recognize it when they see it, maybe they don't, but we definitely see it a lot, especially from like the 80s. When it was like, oh, kids like cartoons, so we'll just slap a cartoon on this thing and they'll never know the difference. And that attitude was so very like boomer marketing executive, that like those of us that were the target of said marketing, sometimes we were just kind of left scratching our heads going, wait, this is a what now? Why is Addams Family, the video game, a side-scrolling platformer? Why does LJN exist? And what are they doing to all of my favorite movie properties? And can they please stop? It was always really funny to me whenever the marketing executive behind insert property here goes, I don't know, just whatever. It's for the kids. They don't care. And meanwhile, us at home, we're just sitting there going, this is it. This is what we get. Okay.
Yeah. It's, totally different time. And one inspiration between writing the book is I hope it inspires Paramount to legitimately re-release a lot more of these games on GOG and Steam, because the issue with the licensing, it's different where Star Wars, most of them were, quite a lot of them were done in-house by LucasArts. So if you go on GOG or Steam and look up Star Wars games, you'll see probably 85% to 90% of those games you can get now, and you can more or less run on a modern day computer.
Right.
But Star Trek, the ones they sell is maybe a dozen out of, well, there's probably over 100 different Star Trek games.
Yeah.
Are we going to ever see all 100 of those on sale? No, but it's also more complicated because it's different developer. They would farm out the development to different companies. And while LucasArts did that too, it was a tighter ship, to say the least.
Yeah, and I would like to imagine a world in which the folks in charge over at Paramount see the value in just converting some of these games to run on modern hardware. Even like something as simple as that, from a game development perspective, it would be relatively cheap, and they'd be able to maybe they wouldn't sell a ton of units of each thing, but the cost to be able to make something Windows 11 compatible, for example, like you mentioned,
Sure.
like it seems like that would be worth the cost of just converting something that's already been made versus hiring full teams and putting together entire production houses to be able to like build a game from the ground up.
Yeah, you don't need to do an HD remake of these things, although it's a bit, I do think if you did a compilation of some Star Trek titles and sold it on, PS5 and Xbox One and whatever, I think that would sell okay.
Sure.
Because we've seen that with, they even did one with like Felix the Cat recently. It's just bizarre, like what ends up coming out.
Funny enough, the Aladdin game, they did something similar for the Nintendo Switch. So you've got Aladdin, Lion King, and Jungle Book all on the same cartridge, and you can play every version of each game from every system back in the day, all on one Nintendo Switch card. I could easily see Paramount, being able to actually make some money off of these old Star Trek game properties if they just combine them into like a, 25-in-1 or even like a 10-in-1.
Yeah, it's not out of the question. We did it. There was a Jurassic Park one that came out not that long ago. So there's a history of them doing this with a movie series and coming out with these titles. So,
I mean, some of these games aren't even megabytes. Like some of the early stuff, we're talking kilobytes of like the size of a text file, like it seems so easy to be able to convert something like that, make it run and sort of tap into that retro nostalgia. If somebody decided that they wanted to, but that's the key, right? Someone's got to decide to want to do that first. So hopefully we'll see. I mean, hopefully they like the book, and hopefully that, like you said, it inspires someone over there to make a couple of decisions regarding the retro gaming community that we could enjoy. So there was one other thing that I wanted to ask you about before we wrap up for today. And I know you kind of mentioned it, but I got to ask you about it. You just worked with a really famous, infamous, Hollywood director who is known for making video game movies, and you helped him with, you said, his memoir?
Yeah, I helped Uwe Boll, who is probably best known for doing the movies of like Postal and Blood Rain, and he did about quite a lot of video game movies in the early 2000s, early aughts, I guess you'd say. Yeah, I helped him with his memoir, and that was a hoot and a half. I mean, I wrote the first English language book on Uwe Boll called The Films of Uwe Boll, Volume 1, The Video Game Movies. I have not done Volumes 2 and 3. And at the time, he said he was retiring from movies. Now he's back making movies. He was a restaurateur for a little bit there. And he's done a few books in Germany. And this English language memoir, which there's no release date yet, but I'll be sure and let you know when that happens. Perhaps that can be a separate show or something. It's a composite of like 3 of his books from Germany. So it has like photos from his personal collection. It talks about his life. It talks about the making of the movies, but it also talks about his thoughts on the environment. It's kind of all over the place. And if you've heard his commentaries, tonally, I think it's sort of like the commentaries, but it also, I think, digs a bit deeper than that. So I'm really, it has been a lot of work. Could you hear that noise outside?
Yeah, but it's fine. It's whatever.
Okay. Funds of living on a busy street. Anyhow, I think working on the memoir with Uwe was a lot of fun. and a lot of research, and I'm eager for it to come out. There's no release date for it yet, but I would hope before the end of the year, but we'll see. But if you want to see me, I talk about it with Uwe some in his podcast, Uwe Boll Raw. Is his English language podcast he does. It's not weekly, but it's close to it. And so you can find that on where you can find podcasts online.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, Far Cry, Blood Rain. Yep. He did the House of the Dead movie, just to name a few. And we don't need to get into like full on movie review mode, but those are movies that he made. And so I think, especially if anybody in the video gaming world that appreciates other media based on video games is gonna know the name Uwe Boll, and I think that just for the story alone, like the man's had a really long career, and obviously has been a pivotal name in the gaming world for a long time. So I'm really fascinated to see what ends up coming out of this project, and once it sort of like is put out into the world, like what it looks like.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning the majority of movies he did weren't video game movies, and I think that's part of what made me interested in him to begin with. He'll do things based on historical atrocities like Auschwitz or things going on in Darfur, and at the same time, yes, doing House of the Dead movies and things that are sort of more populist. So yeah, I can go on about this for a while, but I think that's a good teaser, to say the least.
Well, I think it's great, and I really appreciate you hanging out and telling us all about some of the work that you've been doing. Especially, dude, this Star Trek book is good, and I think people should definitely check it out.
Thanks so much.
So, yeah, Matt, thank you for coming on the show today.
Yeah, and so I'll be speaking at some conventions here coming up. On July 7th, I'll be speaking at LeakyCon in Portland, Oregon, which is a Harry Potter-themed convention.
That's we're about 2 weeks out.
That's right. Yeah, about 2 weeks out. So does the show come out before then?
Well, this will be out on the 1st. So
okay, great.
Yeah, we're just shy of a week out as of the release of this episode.
But I'll be speaking there on Sunday, July 7th. So with Tony and Eric, some of our friends we were mentioning earlier. So
what time is that?
It is at 11:15.
Okay.
And they have the schedule at LeakyCon's website. Ironically, LeakyCon was the first convention I did a panel at, and I've been doing panels at conventions and booking them for about a little bit over a decade now, about 12 years. So to do it again at the place where we did it the first time is real fun. We'll be talking about the Harry Potter RPGs that were on Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance. So based on the first three movies.
Yeah. I one of my other jobs, I worked with a local group called Expelliarmus, who will also be at LeakyCon. I work with them every year on the Yule Ball in December.
Oh, great.
I've been DJing for them since I think 2017. And so, my friends from PD Expelliarmus are also going to be there at LeakyCon. I definitely, if you get a chance to stop by and say hello to them, let them know that DJ Switch sent you. And I hope you have a good time, man. I think it's gonna be a fun weekend, and I hope you get a chance to enjoy it.
Absolutely. The other thing I'll be talking about this Star Trek video games book on two different panels at Star Trek 2 Las Vegas at the Rio in Las Vegas, Nevada, on August the 1st, which is a Thursday. I don't have the times for that yet, but one will be a panel about me talking about the book specifically, and the other will be a panel with other Star Trek video game experts about Star Trek video games in general. So looking forward to that. I've never been to that convention. It's my first time speaking at a convention outside of Oregon. So looking forward to that. And it'll be Las Vegas in August, so it'll be pretty hot.
Star Trek conventions have been a thing since the 60s.
That's right.
But Star Trek Las Vegas these days is like the big boy.
That's what I understand. Yeah, I've never been to it, but
that's like the Trek convention to end all Trek conventions. And so, just getting on a panel at all, let alone two, I think is a really, really cool opportunity. And it sounds like it's going to be really a lot of fun for you, man. I'm really
I'm looking forward to it. I I'm going with my wife, and she likes the Star Trek stuff too, so that'll be fun to have a little mini vacation while we're out there. And this is a fun story to end it on. So I applied for that convention on a lark kind of way in advance, and then the website will say who's coming to the convention. And so I was like one of the first 25 people, and like number 24 was Kate Mulgrew, and I was number 25. And so to see my name next to Kate Mulgrew is kind of ridiculous on the kind of text part of the website where it says, look who's coming to the convention. So,
oh my God. That's insane.
But I took a screenshot. You better believe it. So, yeah. So,
I would too, man. Like,
yeah.
I'm such a big fan. I mean, obviously, Captain Janeway, like,
Yes.
/ Admiral Janeway for the hardcores. Obviously, like, I love that character. I loved her work as Janeway, but her work in Orange is the New Black was also just like top tier. That woman is stellar, and I'm so
absolutely,
like, I so love her work, and I'm so stoked for you that you got to be like, you got to grab that screenshot where your name was right next to hers. That's amazing.
Thanks so much. That means a lot. And I mean, with the crazy thing with I think the first convention I went to was Dragon Con in Atlanta when I was 19 years old.
Okay.
And so to get to speak at these conventions for over a decade now has been just a real blessing. And it's also the first time I did it, I had an out-of-body experience, because I'm used to seeing people on the stage, and then I've spoken on stage before at things, but you're
Sure.
on the stage at a convention speaking to people. From the other end for me, it was a very strange experience. I don't know about you. You've been on all these panels, but
I have the opposite problem. I fall off of stages at.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
No. The last time we did the panel at Fan Expo. So this last Fan Expo this year, unfortunately, it was right during the ice storm here in Portland.
That's right.
And so there was a lot of stuff that got canceled. I was supposed to perform. I was supposed to DJ the after party, the official after party for Fan Expo this year. And I was so bummed I couldn't do it because I really wanted to. And they were so nice, and they were so like working with them was so great. And I was so looking forward to it. And then the ice storm hit, and like, I couldn't get across the bridge. But one of the other things that got canceled was the panel. So my most recent Fan Expo Star Trek panel was actually from 22.
Mm-hmm.
And at Fan Expo in 22, like, I shifted my chair, fell off the stage, through the temporary air wall between the panel rooms and into the panel room next door.
Ouch.
Where thankfully there wasn't another panel going on. It happened to be in between things in that room. And so there was a couple people like kind of standing around because the previous thing had ended. And so when I fell through the wall, like, there was like 3 or 4 people standing around, and all of a sudden my big butt comes like flying through the thing, and they're just like, dude, are you all right? I'm like, and I had one of those moments where I had to like stop, sort of take stock. The wall itself kind of broke my fall.
Good.
And so while I got a little bit of a bump and a little bit of a carpet scratch, because the walls are carpeted, so I got a little bit of a carpet burn on my elbow. But other than that, like, nothing broken, no real bruising. Like, I was fine. And so like I took a beat. My buddy, who was sitting next to me on stage, he kind of like pokes his head through the wall. He goes, "Yo, are you okay?" And I just kind of gave him a thumbs up. And he's like, "All right." I said, "Keep going." And he's like, "Okay." And he looks over at my friend Sarah, who was moderating, and goes, "He says keep going." And so like after a minute, I get up, kind of like shake myself off, kind of collect myself, walked out of the panel room I had fallen into, and then around the corner in the like foyer, and then back into my panel room, where I walked in through the back of the panel room. So I'm like behind the whole audience of people, and everybody starts clapping and cheering. So I get up to the front of the panel room, and before climbing back on the stage, I immediately turn on my heel and I go, "Everybody stop that. I have done so much more to earn less of an applause. That is the biggest applause I've ever earned for doing nothing. So I want you all to stop that right now." And that just got a chuckle from the room. And then I, got back up and I sat down on the opposite end of the table that I had fallen from. So
Sure.
like, I didn't want to go back to that, but yeah, it was a wild experience to have something like that happen at a Star Trek panel at Fan Expo. but they've got you like on these drum risers that don't have any kind of a safety lip or edge to them. Like, you really have to be careful. And especially, like, I'm a big dude. My friend Sean is also a big dude. And so between the two of us and then the two other people that were up on that stage, like, it was a stage that was not really made for 4 people. Sure, and so I'm inching closer and closer as I shift in my chair. I'm just inching towards the edge and then eventually just off the side and through the wall and into the other room.
I feel you on that. When I did my first LeakyCon panel back in, I think, 2012, I was with Eric and Tony and Evan, I believe. That was a long time ago.
Yeah.
we were saying, I sort of gave the introduction to the panel about, I think it was comparing the Harry Potter movies to the books or something was like the panel idea. And I said, there's sure a lot of Harry Potter movies. And then I just kind of pause. I sort of freeze because I'm internally sort of freaking out, having a panic attack about, I'm presenting at a convention. What the hell's going on here? And our friend, good old Eric, put his hand on my shoulder and said, well, yes, Matt, the Harry Potter movies are a journey. Take us there. And that's exactly what I needed to kind of break out of there and, go on with the show. So
it's tough when you don't make a living on a microphone or on a stage and in front of people, like I've been doing for like the last 25 years. It can be tough. It can be tough to sort of like push through that panic response and to be able to sort of collect yourself and then be able to communicate. Believe me when I tell you, it took time. And it took training. I had literal training where I had to, grab a microphone and stand in front of like 8 people, to like, with somebody like judging me the whole time and like telling me what to do before I could eventually get to a point where I was like a semi-competent MC and they could start sending me out on gigs.
Right. I think what helped me is I hosted bar trivia for a year.
There you go.
And doing a 2-hour show where you're coming up with jokes and you're not only hosting it, but you're grading all the quizzes and like that'll kick your ass one way to another, and you kind of get that out of you. Well, we're a bit over, but thank you so much for the switch. This means a lot to me. I'm really happy you reached out. And,
of course.
Look forward to seeing you at you're going to be at LeakyCon or what?
I'm not going to be able to make it to LeakyCon this time.
Okay.
But I'm trying to plan for Rose City. And then of course I'll be back at the Portland Retro Gaming Expo.
Sure.
The one last thing I was going to touch on before we bounce, is there somewhere folks can follow you on social media or find you or keep an eye on like what other projects you've got coming up?
So on Twitter, I guess they've been calling it X for a while, as much as I hate that name.
Yeah.
You can find me on there at MATWBT. If you do matwbt.com, that takes you to my Amazon page. And I also have a Substack. If, you do matwbt.substack.com. I also do a few articles there a month. Some is interviews. That one is kind of more movie focused, but that's called the Film Flam Man.
Perfect. Well, Matt, thanks very much. I appreciate you doing this, man.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So that's going to do it for this episode of Pick Up and Play, folks. Thank you again so much to Matt Bradley-Tschirgi for hanging out and chatting about his brand new Star Trek video game book today. Of course, if you want to pre-order the book, I'll have links available in the description and in the show notes for those of you who are listening on the audio version of this show. I also, of course, I'm going to have a link to my Patreon if you want to find out a little bit more about what Matt thinks is missing from the stack of Star Trek games that he played. And then, of course, all of the other Lost Level content available for every single episode of this podcast. You can find all of that available at patreon.com/DJSwitchPDX. As always, I want to give a big, huge thank you to the Portland Retro Gaming Expo for their help with getting this show out to the world. And, of course, my sponsor, Vault 31 Bar, for helping to make this show happen in the first place. That's going to do it for me, folks. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen today, and I will see you on the next one.